A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
You might have heard those reports that last week in the US, some pro-life advocates were being jailed, silenced and persecuted. Well, we're talking today about how we think as Christians about those prisoners of conscience, targeted because they dared to speak the truth about abortion. The crime committed by 3 men in New Jersey was that they walked into an abortion centre, offering roses to mothers and urging them to choose life. And for this, they were allegedly violently dragged out by police, thrown to the ground and arrested. Now, earlier this year, you might recall, President Donald Trump in the US pardoned a group of pro-life protesters called the DC-9 who were sentenced under Joe Biden's Department of Justice. The DC-9 pro-lifers attempted to prevent abortions in Washington, D.C. and were sentenced to multiple years in prison, meant to silence their dissent until President Donald Trump pardoned them. So here are the questions that you might like to respond to today. Did Donald Trump do the right thing? Did he do the cause of the pro-life movement a favour? And how does the Christian think about being a prisoner of conscience? Well, our special guest today has been jailed 6 times for his Christian pro-life activism, not in the US, but right here in Australia. Graham Preston leads Protect Life, while Graham's wife Liz continues to support pregnant women at Priceless Life Centre in Brisbane. Graham, always a pleasure, but a special welcome back to 2020.
Thanks, Neil.
Graham, Australia is renowned to have the most liberal abortion laws in the world. If we start from a foundation about talking about Australia's laws, is that true? What are your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to think of how they could become more liberal, because certainly here in Queensland, we allow abortion to be done right up until birth. At up to 22 weeks of pregnancy, a woman doesn't need to give any reason. She's just automatically given it on request. After 22 weeks, if she can find 2 doctors who are prepared to do it, she can have an abortion. And so it's quite legal to have an abortion up until the day of birth.
You know, it's shocking for some people to think that people who are pro-life actually get arrested and stand before courts and get convicted and thrown into prison. And oftentimes when I've mentioned, what about the Graham Preston case? Graham's been jailed 6 times. People can't believe that you can be thrown into jail in Australia because you have pro-life views. And so sitting opposite you now, you're in the studio with me. Just a thought or two, perhaps, about how you feel about that, because some people don't believe this even happens in Australia.
Yes, well, it's not simply because of a viewpoint a person holds. No one's been jailed for that in Australia. I did take actions that resulted me being arrested, and similar to the case that you referred to earlier in America, there were a group of us who were taking direct action to try to prevent babies being killed, sitting in the entranceways of abortion clinics in Brisbane, and that resulted in me going to jail. So it wasn't simply for my views, it was because of the actions I was taking.
Okay, when we use that terminology, a prisoner of conscience, you might even align that with being a political prisoner. When someone who holds a different view to the government legislation of the day is arrested and jailed because they have committed a crime. Prisoners of conscience. Is that a good description of people who are pro-life advocates?
Yes, well, this is where it becomes a question of what we believe is the right attitude for a Christian towards the law. And there are Christians who hold different viewpoints on this. Some would say that as Christians we are bound to abide by the laws of the state, whatever they might be. Others, like myself, believe that we have to look at the laws and we have to put before the law of the state what we believe God would have us do. Now, I think it's only going to be in exceptional circumstances that it might mean that a person will deliberately act in such a way that goes against the law of the state, but I do believe there are those exceptions where there is not only a good thing to do, it's the right thing to do. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said, a bad law is not one that we need to obey. And I agree, when it comes to a situation, I mean, think about it, in any other situation, if a born person was being killed and for some reason it was illegal to assist them, we would, I think, say, no, it is still right to try to come to their defence. Does it make it any difference? It's because the child is in the womb that we no longer can come to their defence. And I think that it is the case. We ought to. A life is a life, and if an innocent person is being killed, then I think it is right for Christians to cross that line and say, no, I will come to your defence.
So many things now have permission attached to them. I'm just thinking of some of the decriminalisation of drug laws in places like the ACT and other states wanting to follow. In fact, it's the same in Queensland too. You've got a decriminalisation, then it becomes a permission model. And if you don't have laws that say that killing the unborn is a bad thing, there are people who assume that it's a good thing. Even Christians can be sucked into that. That's why our values come from a different place. How do you describe where the Christians' values come from that puts us up against some of those things that get legalised?
Yes, I think it's understandable for the non-Christian world to equate morality and law, but I think it's a big mistake for Christians to do that. We have to be prepared to see that laws are made by fallible human parliaments, and there's no reason to believe that they will always get it right. And sometimes that mightn't matter too much, but in other cases it matters a great deal. And so when we're talking about instances where the law allows a whole segment of humanity to be killed on request, then I think we have to be prepared to question the validity of that law and act accordingly.
There have been some very courageous people who have stood beside you on the streets. And when you've been arrested in times past, others have been standing alongside you. They've been arrested too. When you go out onto the street and you are standing for what we'd say is a biblical truth, and you might even say common sense, because a scientific truth of where life starts, when you're arrested for those things, are you prepared to be targeted because you are sometimes breaking the law? I mean, you're prepared to actually go through whatever process happens because you know that you're right.
Yeah, I would just want to clarify that when I have been arrested in front of the doors of the abortion clinics, that's one thing. And I also have been arrested at times for just simply standing on the side of the road, holding up signs. But I would point out that in every one of those instances where I've been arrested when it's just standing on the side of the road or holding up signs, I have either the police have dropped the charge or I have been successful in court. So I've never been successfully prosecuted simply for standing on the side of the road holding up signs.
Okay, let's talk truth and lies here for a moment, because when you're protesting and when we say to listeners, stand up for the rights of the unborn, we want them to stand up for what we will see as the truth. The other side that wants to promote abortion, they're saying that they are promoting the truth too, because it's all very, very fluid and things can change for them. But when you stand up for a standard of truth as a Christian believer, what you're saying is the other side is thriving on its own lies. How do you see those things?
Yeah, and I think this is one of the aspects of the whole issue that is most puzzling in some respects, but at the same time shows the reality of how serious all this is, in that I don't think there's anybody who is happily pregnant that doesn't recognise that they're carrying a baby. And we use that language of baby. And everyone's excited for the pregnant woman and father and want to talk about how the baby's growing and developing, excited to see the ultrasound picture of the baby and so on. And when the child is not intended to be there, not wanted, we suddenly change our attitude, we change our vocabulary, we change everything. We no longer talk about a baby, the word fetus is used, and people want to be able to say that, well, if you don't want this fetus, you can get rid of it. And so we have a complete change of attitude towards that same being. If the being doesn't change, it's the same being. It's a baby in both instances, whatever vocabulary other people use. And our society wants to say, well, that's okay. If the person doesn't want that child, they can kill it. And I think we've got to be prepared to say, well, no, we can't be inconsistent like that. We need to remain consistent in what we are saying, and we can't just dispose of a life because it's no longer wanted.
I think it is consistent across all the Christian denominations to say that that child in the womb is a baby. And yes, caution around the other terminologies that people try to use to justify taking the life of that baby away. Come back to what's going on in the United States and the issue that we talked about, the DC-9. Those 9 protesters who were imprisoned because they were conscientious objectors. They didn't want to see abortion happening. They were happy enough to speak up and bear the consequences. And then Donald Trump pardoned the prisoners. Was that a moment of justice? How do you see things?
Yes, well, I've given a lot of thought to this because on one hand, of course, I'm very happy that those people have been set free. I don't believe they should have ever been sent to prison in the first place. For intervening peacefully to try to save the life of a child should never be a crime, and those people, I believe, are heroic in their actions and have done the right thing. But at the same time, I am concerned about the way in which the release has been achieved. I think it's a case of always got to look at, do the ends justify the means? And I think in this case, for Donald Trump simply to have given an executive order bypassing the whole legal system in the process and setting them free, I think it can create potentially very difficult precedents. It's not as if he's the first person to use executive orders, but at the same time, to do this, and I think, one of the foundations of a democracy is the separation of powers between the politicians and the courts and so on, and for him to just bypass the decisions of the court, because these people had broken the law as they stood, and in that sense they had committed a crime in the eyes of the state, and to just bypass that, I think, is a dangerous thing to do, because the potential is that for a future president, if let's say there at some point some abortionists were prosecuted and sent to jail, a future president perhaps could just say, well, I'm going to pardon them and just let them out. And the rule of law gets broken down by these sorts of things. Many people were upset when Joe Biden, the previous president, gave amnesty from prosecution for that whole group of people. And again, we saw that as, probably most people saw that as an abuse of the legal process to do that. And I think in doing this, Donald Trump has done something that I think could be very problematic. And instead of just giving them a pardon, the laws need to be changed, and then there's no problems.
Helping you make sense of life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 on Vision.
And our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. One of those sort of conundrum type questions today. Maybe there's no right or wrong answer, but maybe there is, because we're talking about those who are thrown into prison as prisoners of conscience, standing up for a pro-life cause. In other words, someone who says, well, the law of God is higher than the laws of the land. I think I'll stand for the laws of God. But that brings you into conflict with the laws of the land, and sometimes that gets you into all sorts of legal problems. And we've seen through history where that's happened. Christian believers even persecuted for their faith because they'll stand for a Christian principle and against some of those things that are legalized because governments change their mind. Or even in a democracy where we have, 51% of the vote says we want this, and so therefore it becomes law. Graham, you've been thrown into jail 6 times. Have you ever been pardoned for any of the convictions that you've had?
No, not. It's a complicated story, and to try to tell as briefly as I can. But I was fined many times because we did many of these actions, and I had a whole list of unpaid fines. Then I won it was the first time I went to jail. I met a lawyer in jail. I mean, another prisoner, and we became friends. He gave me some advice, and he said, "Well, next time you go to court," he said, "take this line of defence." And I did, and we actually won, not on the principle of whether abortion is killing a child or not, but it was on a more technical point, and we won. And on the basis of that win, I asked, well, how can I now appeal these previous convictions, because I had a whole string of them. And the only avenue it appeared that I had was to appeal to the governor. And I thought, well, that's pretty unlikely that, because it was, just trying to think of her name, I can't remember, but she became the Governor General. Anyway, so I wrote to her and set out that I had been now found innocent on that charge. And incredibly, much to the astonishment of lawyers I knew, she did pardon half of the fines. And so I have had a pardon in one sense like that, but that was on the basis of a legal victory.
When we think of what's happened in the US, Donald Trump pardoning the DC-9, and, you know, the abuse of executive orders. Now, I don't think we're putting the US democracy on trial here today, but this doesn't happen in Australia. But there's a certain amount of power that's invested in the United States president that the Prime Minister in Australia doesn't have, or the state premiers, they don't have, and that's because we have this very firm understanding of a separation of powers. How do you see that separation of powers being a protection, or from abuse of the laws that we might see if there's executive orders? How do you see that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's sort of tantalising to see the way in which so much President Trump was able to do in a very short time with his hundreds of executive orders and so on. But you stop and think, well, what do you even need a Congress or a Parliament for if he can do all of this just basically on his own initiative and make all these changes? And I do think that there's a high degree of risk of developing more dictatorial powers, and so I think it is probably the better way to try to see change made through the changing of laws rather than just executive pronouncements.
Okay, that's the hard road. The easy road, if you've got that sort of power invested in the president, it's a little bit like being the king. The US system works a little bit more like that, more like the king making an order and everybody jumping to attention. But it's a hard road when you say we've got to work with changing the laws the hard way. There's a process. How do you see that?
Oh, yeah, that's true, and that is the hard way. And I don't know if we'll get onto this, Neil, but what's happened here in Queensland under the new Premier, it's made it even harder. So, yes, it is a very hard road to go. But I do think in order to try to keep stability and avoid an excess of power in the hands of one person, that ultimately is the better way to go.
Graham, if a person is prepared to engage in civil disobedience, you're going to stand for what is right, for a just cause, and let's say the pro-life cause, a just cause, do you think they need to be prepared to serve whatever penalty comes without even any special favour? Is that something that has to be a part of the person who's going to stand strong and be a leader in this area?
I do think that is a necessary aspect of it, that the person has to go into it with their eyes open and know that if you're prepared to break a law and there are set penalties for doing so, that you have to expect that you're likely to have to pay that price. And if you're not willing to, then I think then it's not appropriate for you to go that way. I think it's just part of the nature of what it means to be prepared to carry out civil disobedience, that you are, as the laws of the state stand at that time, breaking them, and there are going to be consequences for doing so, and you have to accept that that's the case.
Let me just ask you, if you don't do it the long way, and you hoped that there was going to be some easy outs here, the prospect of supposing the tables turned and it wasn't pro-lifers being pardoned. But if it was a group of abortionists who had been jailed because they had committed some crimes against those unborn children, about whether you would feel good about that sort of pardon. Is that the other way to look at it?
Yeah, I think that's the case, that when it suits you and goes in your favour, you might think, well, having this ability to do that isn't such a bad thing. But of course, if it can be done in your favour, it can also be done against you. And so I think that's the danger.
Right, well, we might talk some more about that too. And not too long out from news, let's take a quick call, an anonymous caller calling through. Welcome along. What's your point?
Oh, hi there, Neil. This is Alice. I just wanted to give a little bit about my story as a victim of domestic violence and a Christian woman. It's a very difficult conversation to have, especially for me, because it involves the lives of children that I was not able to have because of the lack of support and the lack of choice that I had, or that I felt that I had at the time. And so I was married, divorced after my husband committed adultery, and then I was left in that marriage and then targeted by a man who went into churches and looked for vulnerable women and happened to find me, rape me for, financial purposes, and then was also threatening my life. So it was a very, very scary, frightening situation for me. I'd never been in a situation like that, so I was frozen, which was my trauma response. I didn't have the support of the church because of the divorce, and they didn't know, obviously, about what my husband had been doing because I'd protected him, and as a result, I was targeted by them too. So when I did actually go to get the support from my family to have the baby, it was met with not very kind words, and that was just to simply get rid of the baby because it will impact on my reputation and also possibly my safety in the future with the man who was repeatedly raping me.
Alice, your story is a heart-wrenching story because there's so many dimensions there, including coercion and people being targeted, vulnerable people, and I'd call you vulnerable in the circumstance where someone in church life is taking advantage of you, vulnerable in some ways. But let me bring Graham Preston into a conversation here, because I did mention in the introduction that Graham's wife, Liz, continues to support pregnant women at Priceless Life Centre in Brisbane. And Graham, as you hear Alice's story, this is a story you've heard similar ones before. What are your thoughts here for Alice?
Yes, well, Alice, first of all, we just want to give you expression of every sympathy for the very difficult circumstances you found yourself in, and as Neil has said, if people do not have support elsewhere, and it's tragic to hear that your church didn't even support you, but there is a whole network of centres such as Priceless right throughout Australia, and we would encourage anybody who find themselves in difficulty due to unintended pregnancy to contact one of these centres and just look up pregnancy support, and you'll get in touch with such a group in wherever you might, or near perhaps where you live if you're in a country town. But seek out such support, because there are people who will provide counsel and practical support in difficult situations such as yours. But it is a tragic story, and we have our sympathy, and abortion is not the unforgivable sin. God forgives us, those who are repentant, as I'm sure you are. And I trust that you have been able to find a church that will truly give you the support you need.
Alice, while we've got you here, when you've gone through your circumstances and the church there perhaps not rising to that level that you had hoped, you carry not only a sense of guilt having lost a child, but you've got the sense of guilt and even shame that comes along that. Is this something, you were going through this and you were already a woman of faith. That must have been very challenging for you.
Yes, and look, guilt and shame probably would not be in the list that I would express. It was fear and trepidation. and my life was at risk. So the person, that had targeted me had already seen a hitman to go and kill his wife, and this has already been, reported to the police, who also did nothing. So I could see that even though the ex-wife had gone to lengths to protect herself, that she was not protected. And so what it showed me was that the community as a whole was missing the point that the woman in this case, that was me, and there are many, many others that I've spoken to now, and I've now gone into that kind of work. But, I think the mothers are the missing person in this scenario, and there are many, many situations where mothers are actually grieving for the children that they're about to lose. And the last thing that they want is to lose that child. But they feel at the time, because of the trauma of what's just happened, that they're not able to find a way out. And when there is absolutely not one person to support, that is the greatest tragedy of all, because I believe that, this is about mothers and children. This is about two lives. And I just feel that the churches probably, should be encouraged to not only fight for the children, but to fight for the mothers and to understand the story, because once they understand the story, I think many, many children will be saved as a result.
There are perpetrators and there are victims, and there are a lot of women who are victims, and, let's not put a blanket across saying that every time these things happen, that the woman is the victim, but in most cases, I'm suspecting here, where coercion happens, either from the man or from family, this sort of thing is a very challenging thing. Graham, Preston, your thoughts about the coercion that happens, and if you've got grey areas in the way you treat a life, coercion is going to be coming in like a flood, isn't it?
Yes, and I think the more our society accepts abortion, the more people can think that, well, it's legitimate for them to coerce people, because they think, well, it's legal, it's accepted, what's wrong with you, why don't you just do this? And I think that's going to become tougher for women to stand up and do the right thing. But we would urge people always to do that and to seek out, because there is help available, and I think that's, to do it on your own is extremely tough, but to find people who will stand with you is what's needed. And I would speak to all the church leaders and say, work with these pregnancy support centres. I know Priceless is seeking to do that, to have a working relationship with churches so that they can mutually enable the work to help mothers and their children to go forward. And so that's what is needed, a working relationship between churches and pregnancy support centres.
And it can't happen, can it? And I've still got Alice on the line here. It can't happen just because one person, the pastor or the priest or the minister, the leader of the church, has some way of thinking through these issues. This is something that whole congregations need to have been brought up to speed on, that there's real action required in care in our broader community. It's not just about raising your hands and having a prayer at church on Sunday. There's some activity that needs to happen. Graham, what are you thinking about the activity and what you've seen in churches over many years?
Well, I would just encourage all listeners to speak to church leaders where you're involved and ask them, what are we prepared to do to work with a pregnancy centre to support them to be known in the community as a church that will help women in difficulty. And I've written to all the churches in Queensland and said to them, put up a sign in a prominent place on your property that says, pregnant, ? We will help you, with a phone number. And if every church had a sign up like that and people in difficulty went past them and saw that, then it would make the world of difference.
And it's not as though they have to be experts. They just need to know who to call, referral. And just while we've got Alice on the line here, when we talk about your Priceless Life Centre and continuing to support pregnant women, someone who's carrying some of the trauma of what they've gone through in the past, are they welcome to call in and have a talk and those sorts of things?
Yes, certainly the pregnancy support networks don't simply provide assistance before an abortion, but in situations where a woman has had an abortion and are grieving, they also provide a very important role in helping women recover from that.
Alice, I want to thank you for courageously calling in today and just sharing your story. Really appreciate you.
Thank you, Neil. And if I can just say one last thing, I would really love for Graham to work towards getting an advocate in every church, because if a woman knows that there is an advocate in her church, it's so much easier to go to that person knowing that that church is actually going to support her and the baby.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alice. And our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316, 1800 316 316. Let me just ask you here, coming back to the US case, where we're talking about what's happening with, Donald Trump and the pardons for the DC-9. Now there's more pro-life advocates who have been jailed. And, of course, it's changed in the US, hasn't it? You've got Roe versus Wade was overthrown at a national level in the US, and that put the responsibility back onto the states. But the upcoming trial proves that pro-life persecution hasn't stopped at just at the national level. It happens in the states. So states in Australia have lots of power when it comes to the abortion laws, Graham. It's not so much a federal issue, but a state level issue, and things that are happening in Queensland. There's so many things I want to ask you, but of course, David Crisafulli, the Queensland Premier, he's banned talking about abortion on the floor of Parliament. When we talk about the way that executive orders work in the US, isn't that something similar that he looks like he's trying to do?
Well, it's not quite an executive order, because they did have a vote as to whether or not that would be accepted, and that's the tragedy of it. It wasn't just simply he who said that should be the case, but it required the votes of all the LNP members to support that to get it through. And they did, every one of them. And many of them had indicated that they were pro-life, but they voluntarily agreed to say for the next 4 years abortion will not be talked about in the Queensland Parliament. Almost unbelievable. I can't even credit that such a ruling is allowed, that any topic can be forbidden from discussion in the Parliament, but apparently that's the case, and they've all agreed to do it.
You stood outside the Queensland Parliament with a sign in that very first sitting week. What sort of message were you delivering?
Yeah, well, I just had a sign that in big letters just had shame Crisafulli, shame LNP, shame Labor, because of course it was Labor that introduced these laws that allowed for abortion up to birth. But with alongside a picture of an aborted baby, a very grisly, awful picture, but I felt that it was necessary to confront the politicians with what they were saying nobody would be allowed to talk about in our Parliament. And I think it is greatly to the shame of our Premier that he did this. I mean, he would say that he was just following up on a promise he made before the election, and because he had said before the election that there would be no debate about changing the abortion law in Queensland, and so he said he was just following up on that. But the pro-life members of the LNP should have all, at that point, said, well, if you're going to ban us from talking about it, we'll jump ship, because there's nothing more important than the Queensland Parliament to talk about than abortion. But they've now accepted it will not be discussed.
Sometimes we talk about a war on free speech, and I think that is happening all over Australia, federally and in the states. But a war on pro-life speech, you could say as much as you want to, in some sense here out in the public and on the radio, but if they won't talk about it in the Parliament, that's like a war on pro-life speech, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. It's just a shameful thing to have introduced and to have accepted.
Hey, you go out on the streets, and for listeners, just to create a picture in their minds as to what you have been doing now for decades, and I've known you for decades. You go out on the streets, you're holding up signs. Some people are choosing what shirt they're going to wear out of their wardrobe each morning. You're looking at your selection of signs and thinking, which one will I take out today? Paint a little picture of you standing on a street corner, and you like to do this in the Brisbane CBD. What does it look like when you're standing on the street?
Oh, and in the suburbs, wherever there's a busy intersection, lots of people about. We go to probably about 60, 70 different places around Brisbane. So sometimes, yes, it's in the city where there's lots of pedestrian traffic. Well, you never know what's going to happen from one moment to the next. We usually go in the morning, during the morning peak hour, from about 6:45 in the morning to 9 o'clock, and even up to the last moment, something challenging can happen. And so I mean, I could go on all day telling you all the different things that have happened over the years, but just recently, late last year, a fellow this was only 5 minutes before I was planning to leave, he just barged straight into me as he crossed the road, nearly knocked me off my feet, grabbed the signs out of my hand. I grabbed him and he dragged me along, and a whole bunch of people, because a lot of people crossing the street, a lot of people around, stopped, and I ended up letting him go. And to cut the story short, a lady, because I was wondering what to do at this point. He'd gone off with my signs. I didn't even see where he'd got to. But a lady came up to me and she said, "Oh, I know where he works." And I said, "Oh, how do you know?" She said, "Well, I followed him when he went into the building, up to his office, and saw the signs all crumpled up on his desk." And I said, "Oh, that's amazing." And as it happened, he was working for a major, well-known legal firm here in Australia. And she called the police, and the police came, and the police came up to me, and they said, "Right, what's happened?" I explained it, and they said, "Oh, well, the guy's already in custody. He'd handed himself into the police." So I presume he thought this wasn't going to be good for his legal career to be up for an assault charge and theft charge. So some remarkable things like that happen, and good things as well. I mean, positive things. A lady came up not long ago and said how she'd been to the doctor when she was 6 weeks pregnant, and the doctor said, "Oh no, you got a babe. The baby's got a heartbeat now. You can't have an abortion." And she didn't. And she said as she walked off, and the baby, he's now 9 years old, and she was very happy because and this doctor had said the right thing to her, that no. So there are some good doctors out there, but there's a lot of doctors that aren't very good.
What are the bans on pro-lifers right now? And maybe this varies state to state, territory to territory, but we know that there's the 50-metre bubble zone laws around abortion clinics. That's the case, I think, in a number of states. What other sort of bans are there for pro-lifers?
Now, it's not 50 metres, it's 150 metres.
Oh, 150 metres.
Yes, they try to keep you out of sight of the abortion clinic. Apart from that, I'm not aware of any other restrictions. And so, as I said, over the years, I have been arrested just simply for standing on the side of the road. But after this happened, I think 5 times, and the police just dropping charges and so on, the magistrates got very cross with the police and told them off for arresting me and not going on with it, because there was no justification. There was not doing anything illegal by standing on the side of the road with signs. And so now pretty much the police leave me alone.
We've had whole conversations in earlier times of just some of the encounters that you have on the street. And I might say it makes colourful reading to recognise that you are the object of the abuse of an awful lot of people. And you're not even a stranger now to people swerving their cars towards you on the footpath. Perhaps that's just a fear tactic, but you've had this, and even a bus driver recently.
Yeah, it's on one hand, I don't want to make it sound too difficult, because on the other hand, I would like to encourage people to be doing the same thing as I am, and people right around the country. It's a pretty simple thing to do, and challenging, no doubt, but at the same time, I think the worst thing that can happen is that people get totally used to abortion, and it's just going on in the background and nobody thinks about it. We've got to keep it in front of the community's eyes, and that requires people to be prepared to get out there and make a stand. And so, yes, it's difficult, and I'd encourage people to try to find someone else to go with them, but get out there and just speak up on behalf of the unborn.
For you, this is like a career calling, Graham, and you've been doing it for so long now. I don't think you're about to stop anytime soon. Even throwing you in jail doesn't work, so somebody should get that message, because they've tried that 6 times. Hey, let me just, as we just lighten up the thoughts around the end of our conversation here, you're actually a pretty fabulous artist, and you even have one of your pictures hung in the Royal Queensland Art Gallery. I mean, do people put two and two together? They say, oh, this artist who's painted this portrait is actually Graham Preston?
I don't know, but I would hasten to add, it sounds impressive, the Royal Queensland Art Gallery, and it is a nice gallery, but it's not the Queensland Art Gallery, which is the bigger one. And so, yes, I currently have a picture hanging in the Royal Queensland Art Gallery, and I do enjoy doing art, and if any listeners want any artwork done for them, I'd be more than happy to assist them.
And they'd connect with you. Is your art separate to the Protect Life website?
Yes.
Just give us free kick here. How do listeners connect with you because of your art and actually see some of the pictures that you've painted?
Yes, well, you can see my Instagram page and get in touch with me. I'll give you the Instagram address. It's GP, that is GEEPEE .art7000 in digits, 7000. So GEEPEE.art7000.
Okay, that's for Instagram. And to connect with Graham, protect-life.info is the web address to connect with Graham on that pro-life level. Protect-life. You might even want to go and stand alongside Graham, test the waters and see what it's like standing on the street as a pro-life advocate. And I did mention that Graham's wife, Liz, continues to support pregnant women at Priceless Life Centre in Brisbane. There's a website there too, pricelesslife.org, pricelesslife.org. Wonderful getting your insights once again. Graham Preston, thanks for joining us today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.